Jim, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. It's great to be kind of back in Melbourne. It's been 6 years since I moved to glorious sunny Canberra. Sunny, yes. Cold. That's the bit that kills everyone. The cold. We did get up to a top of about 16 today, so it wasn't too bad. Yeah, low of like -2, but yeah. But today we're talking about fabric, and is that nice and readable? I'm liking laughter. That's great. I learned a lot about the fashion industry as part of putting this thing together because, you know, writing the abstract. Yeah, fabric. It walked down the catwalk and looked all amazing.
Yeah, straight down.
And yeah, it actually turns out that most of the outfits that people wear on a catwalk are absolutely hideous. And yeah, jeans and a t-shirt I think is way better. But that's just me. So I did convince my lovely wife to do a little bit of photoshopping, a couple of pictures. So I think she's done well with this one. And there's one more coming up. But yeah, let's just say at the outset, I know very little about the fashion industry, and I think anyone who knows me would agree that I'm not the most fashionable type person there is. So I'm also assuming that most people have heard about fabric. Is there anyone who hasn't seen the high-level overview of fabric? Hands up. You can see you all, except for the people online. No, everyone's heard about fabric. Excellent. So I will go over just a little bit of what it is, and then we'll dive into a demo where I have no safety net, and we'll just get started from the start, you know, creating a workspace and really starting to use fabric. Has anyone actually used fabric in the room in any sort of anger? No? Excellent. All right. So Greg has. That was to be expected, Greg. But I'd love to hear about your experiences once I finish talking. So essentially, just recapping, fabric basically, I mean, Microsoft probably don't like it. I didn't introduce myself, did I? I should probably do that. So I'm Jim. I'm a Azure technical specialist in the data and AI space with Microsoft here in Canberra, mostly looking after FedGov customers. And I'm also in the Fabric Champs team, which is essentially an escalation point between the general Microsoft field staff and the CAT team. So it was the Power BI CAT team. Now it's the Synapse CAT plus Power BI CAT turning into the Fabric CAT. Lots of CATs, lots of fabrics. But essentially all that means is all the really hard questions about Power BI in the country tend to filter their way through me before they get up to the CAT team. So I've seen some scary stuff. Ooh, when the camera moves. Cool. So Fabric. The easy way to think about Fabric is we've taken Synapse, we've smushed it inside Power BI and whacked on a bit of storage under the covers. So that's the very, you know, one-liner, if you wish. So we now have Data Factory, both for pipelines and standard data engineering with notebooks and data flows, etc., straight out of Synapse. We have the dedicated SQL pool now in Fabric. We have data science capabilities, machine learning models, experiments, etc. Also smushed into Fabric, we have the real-time analytics, which is the KQL Azure Data Explorer workload. Power BI, that can't really say it's been smushed into Fabric because it's always been there. It's really just the endpoint for all of this. And Data Activator is not one I've had the joy of playing with yet, but the idea there is it takes action based on data triggers. one way to think about Fabric as a whole is, oh, we lost the camera. I can't see you all anymore. One way to think about Fabric is kind of like Office. It has lots of little products underneath. So from that point of view, Power BI is just like Excel, just one component of the larger ecosystem. We have the one lake underneath all that, and the main story, I'm going to ignore admitting people because you guys can do that. The main story is Fabric is a SaaS product, so software as a service, as opposed to Synapse being platform as a service. And the idea is to basically make it really, really simple to deploy. So even with the Synapse architecture, you still have to worry about storage accounts and creating your data lake and setting up a whole lot of different things. Whereas Fabric, you just need capacities, and that's about it. I've said a lot of this already, but core features, it's a complete analytics platform. It's not quite where it needs to be today because it is still in preview. There's a lot of activity happening in the next, 12, 24 months. The roadmap is quite detailed. So there will be a lot of changes that you'll see between now and when it goes GA. All changes for the better, but with the tools that we have today, it is pretty good at what it does. Still a couple of little bugs, but nothing too serious. And I'm not going to touch the AI side of anything tonight, but yeah, there's a whole lot of AI excitingness in there, from co-pilots to help you code during notebooks. And everyone's probably seen the videos for the Power BI co-pilot. Everyone seems to want to be on that private preview. Fortunately, it's very restricted at the moment. So Fabric does support many different personas. I love how the camera just zoomed in on Kelly then as she coughed. That was great.
We've been having a couple of technical difficulties in here, so I think we caught everything. But just letting you know, when the camera dies, your sound dies for 10 seconds.
Oh, really?
So yeah, we're just trying to keep on top of it, but we know it's happened in here before. It's a dodgy connection somewhere. So normally it settles down, but if it becomes a problem, we'll do something about it.
Yeah, and the recording will still capture everything I say.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So one of the main things about Fabric is there's a lot of different personas that could be playing with the data, from data engineers, data scientists, data analysts, and data citizens. And they all kind of have different needs. And to support that, Fabric has various experiences, which I have to confess I never actually use. You don't have to use the various experiences. You can still get access to everything. But it does make life a little bit easier if you're not used to the entire suite. Data skills as well. One lake. So rather than creating a data lake that you have to create storage accounts, and maybe you need to add more storage accounts, and then you've got to worry about which storage account is things living in. Fabric's concept of one lake turns the entire concept of the data lake into a data lake as a service. So you don't have to worry about storage accounts. You don't have to worry about where your data is located. It's a global lake. There's one main endpoint that you can connect to get access to the data, and it will basically figure out where that data is and go grab it for you, which is super cool. There's also regional level endpoints as well. So if you want to guarantee that you're only getting data from Australia East, then you can connect to the Australia East endpoint, and you'll be guaranteed that you'll only be seeing Australia East data. You won't be seeing data that's over in Arizona. That is one global they're all global endpoints. They're the same endpoint for every customer. So it all depends on who you've authenticated as you hit that endpoint as to what you'll be able to see. And of course, you need permissions inside the OneLake to see any content at all. And we'll get into how those permissions work in a minute. Serverless compute. I won't go too detailed into this, but effectively everything in the OneLake that uses all these different engines at the top here all natively use Delta Parquet tables as their native format. And that gives us a couple of benefits, one of which is you can use any engine to talk to any Delta table. So although your data might be sitting in a lakehouse, you can still access that lakehouse from your warehouse, or access that from a KQL database, or Power BI could query it directly. I'm giving away some of the secrets from my next couple of slides, but that's all right because we're going to get through them quickly. Michael did ask a question, is it guaranteed the data will be held in one jurisdiction? And the answer is yes, because the data in the OneLake is aligned with the Fabric capacities, and the Fabric capacities are located in one Azure region. So if you stand up a capacity inside Australia East, then any data that is associated with that capacity will be sitting in Australia East with that capacity. And again, if you stand one up in Arizona, West US 3, any data attached to that capacity will be over in Arizona. So yeah, you're guaranteed that it won't be held where you don't expect it. The question then is, will the data move between locations to be processed? And that can be a yes. There are plans to be able to put policies around what the data can do. So if you wanted to ensure that the data would never leave, say, Australia, then domains should be a way to do that. But I don't think that's in there today. All right. And then we have a couple of animations about all our different engines, all going to different locations of the OneLake. Excellent. We're all dealt. Okay, cool. One copy is another big aspect of Fabric. So one of the main problems was everyone had a siloed copy of data. And usually the first thing you do if you wanted some data, you'd do some sort of ETL to get it out of one database and into your one, which meant now you've got multiple copies of the data, they're taking up more space. So if you did want to have a table from Customers 360 in finance, you would copy it. With Fabric, we can use shortcuts to make that table appear as though it's in finance, and that way finance can make use of Customers 360 without having to do any sort of ETL. It's always up to date. You only need to load it once in Customers 360, and then everyone else who uses that can use it. And if you have existing data lake storage, whether it's sitting in Azure or AWS, they're both available now. Google is coming soon. You can shortcut those locations into your OneLake as well to make it a multi-cloud logical lake. And it also means that you can run queries across, say, some data sitting in finance, join it to a table that's sitting in Azure Data Lake Store, and join that to a table sitting in AWS without having to integrate the data yourself manually. Of course, there will be some performance considerations. If the table is sitting in AWS, it's going to have to copy the data over before it can process it. But it's still very cool. On the Power BI side, we've introduced the direct lake mode. So we had direct query, we had import, now there's direct lake, which is similar to direct query, but not quite. So sometimes direct lake will fall back into direct query if needed. But the idea is that you no longer have to import data into a data set into Power BI, because Power BI can natively read those Delta files. So one less thing you have to worry about during your nightly ETL processing. Cool. That's unfortunately the last cool Fabric Photoshop job we've got. But I like that one. All right, demonstrations. Do we have any questions before we kick off? Graham's been typing for about 2 minutes. Is the Power BI capacity the Fabric capacity? Yes and no. Let's talk about capacities, because that's the first thing we get to talk about. So in my demos tonight, I'm starting from scratch. The only thing I really have already stood up is a Fabric capacity, a on-premises data gateway installed on my desktop here, and that's pretty much it. And of course, I've got Fabric up and running. So let's talk about capacities. So you can have a capacity. There's a few ways you can get them. You can use an existing Power BI premium capacity, so P1 up to P5. And if you do happen to use one of those, the Fabric workloads won't cost you anything. They won't account for any of your usage until the 1st of October. So you can effectively think of that as free. You can also get a trial capacity, and that's basically going into Power BI, starting a free Fabric trial. That's per user, if your organization has allowed it. I know many haven't, but if you do go for one of those trial capacities, you get 60 days. But Microsoft has been pretty good so far at automatically extending that 60 days as long as you're using it, at least until GA. Yeah, we might decide to cut that off at any time we want, but so far it's been pretty consistent. The counter just keeps going back up to 60 days. But let's have a look at the Azure Fabric capacities. So this is really the future going forward in how you'll get capacities. So the problem with premium capacities through Power BI is they're kind of expensive. They start at $6,800 a month. You can't pause them. They're harder to provision because of that initial cost outlay. You can't pause them. They're expensive, and they're pretty big and chunky. The smallest one is a P1 capacity. With a Azure capacity, it's very similar to the Azure SKUs that you can have with Power BI embedded, so the A SKUs, in that you can create them at any time, you can pause them, and you can scale them at any time. But the actual functionality between them is pretty much the same. So a P1 premium capacity is functionally identical to a F64 Fabric capacity. So here's my Fabric capacity I've already got stood up. It only literally takes about 30 seconds to create one. All you need to do is tell it the location where you're putting it and give it a name and who the administrator for that capacity is, and 30 seconds later, it's ready to go. So I've currently got it paused. Let's just change the size. You don't have to pause it to change the size. You can just come in here and select a new SKU. So it's currently in F2, which is the smallest, with 2 capacity units and $306 a month. Great for development. and a lot more attractive than having to buy an F64 premium capacity to get the same features. The main things to note about these sizing is the F8 is kind of the smallest one you need for Power BI content. Anything smaller and you're looking at just doing more Synapse type workloads. And the F64 is the smallest one you need to have unlimited distribution of Power BI reports. So if you don't want to have to give everyone a pro license, you'd need an F64. And you will note that it's a lot more expensive. This price is basically the pay-as-you-go per minute kind of pricing. The benefit of this is you can pause it when it's not in use, or you can scale it down when it's not in use. And there's no reserved instance pricing yet. So that's why this number looks so much higher than 6,800, well, $5,000 for a P1. But I'm going to start with an F8. Go resize. So that's happily resized, but I've still got it paused. So let's resume it as well. The good thing about the F2 is it costs you about 36 US cents per hour, which is reasonably cheap considering what you can do with it. So that should start very quickly. Done. All right. Now we can go back into Power BI. So just to recap, that Fabric capacity is located in Australia East. My Power BI tenancy, we go about Power BI, is in West US 3 in glorious Arizona. But pretty much everything we're doing tonight will be located in Australia East. So we won't have to worry about anything. We won't have to worry about data traveling to the US and back, etc. Right. This is where I need my notes. What was I doing next? A new workspace. That's a good start. So let's create a brand new workspace. And yes, as I might have mentioned, there is no safety net here. If anything breaks, yeah, it could be a very interesting demo. Let's call this call it Melbourne for the fun of it. And I can choose which license mode. So it's defaulted to Fabric capacity, and I can choose which Fabric capacity I'm using. So essentially, a workspace is associated with a Fabric capacity. And just like any other workspace, you have the users that have contributor, member, admin, or viewer permissions. I'm just going to be using one user today, so I won't get too detailed into that. But also in the workspace settings, you can come in here, you can change which capacity it's running on. Maybe I'd want to put it on a premium capacity. I don't have one, that's why I'm using Fabric capacity. But you can move it between capacities pretty easily. So the good thing about having lots of little capacities is every team could have their own capacity that could be billed in a slightly different way. So it makes charging back potentially quite a lot easier. There's the option there for trial as well. But unfortunately, I've only got a PPU trial in this environment. You can also, well, when you attach the capacity, you get Spark Compute behind the scenes. And you can configure what that Spark Compute is like. There's a starter pool. You can create a new pool if you wish to run your Spark workloads. Depending on the size of the capacity, will impact how big these numbers can be and what size nodes you can have. So I'm going to leave that as default. You can also choose the runtime version and add some extra Spark properties, which can be handy. There's also library management there as well. The other big thing, I mentioned experiences before. We're currently in the Power BI experience, but we can switch into Data Factory or any of the Synapse options down here as well. I don't often use these just because you can always go up to new and go show all to see everything. But yeah, we're only seeing Power BI options here at the moment. So if I was to switch to data engineering and back into the Melbourne workspace, we'd see a different set. So pipelines, data flows, event streams, experiments, KQL databases and queries, lakehouses, models, notebooks, reports. That's a Power BI one. Spark job definitions and warehouses. Lots of different options. Cool. But just out of habit, I'll stick with Power BI. So let's get some data into our environment. Let's go a brand new show all notebook. So in the show all, you can see everything, a quick description of what it does. And we'll go notebook. So we're creating a brand new notebook. Yay, we have a notebook. Yeah, I skipped over the step that said create a new lakehouse. That's okay, we can do it here. So a notebook likes to have a lakehouse to stash all its data in. If we go add, we can go new lakehouse, so we can create it here, or we can attach an existing one. Let's call it fashion. So got a lakehouse, it's called fashion, it's just loading in. It has tables, it has files, but there's nothing in there yet. Awesome. If you are ever confused about the difference between a lakehouse and a warehouse and a data mart and all of that sort of fun stuff, there is a nice decision guide page, which I'll paste in chat for those that can see the chat. But it does go through what the different options are in each. So essentially, a data warehouse is the dedicated SQL pool. The lakehouse is typically just a Spark-based, everything's Delta Parquet under the covers. And any engine can talk to anything else, but there are some restrictions in that if you're writing to a data warehouse, you use T-SQL. If you're writing to a lakehouse, you use Spark. So you can't use Spark to write to a data warehouse unless you happen to connect to the SQL endpoint and write some T-SQL to it. But yeah, there's a few differences between them. Today, we're going to look primarily at lakehouses. But I'm happy to answer plenty of questions about warehouses when needed. Cool. Back to Power BI. First thing, let's rename this notebook. Rename it to load taxi data. So I was thinking, well, if we're going to a fashion show, we need to get there via a taxi. So let's load in a whole bunch of data from the New York City taxi data set. I thought that was a pretty good segue, and it kind of falls apart after that. So we'll leave the fashion comparisons at that. So I pasted in a bunch of code because you didn't really want to see me type that out. But essentially, we're grabbing a bunch of functions and types to use later. We're getting the data from a publicly accessible storage account. We're just grabbing 2016 data. And then we're filtering it by that year just to get the 2016, adding a brand new column for the driver ID. This will, we'll get a list of drivers a bit later. So now we know who actually drove that taxi, and do a bit of column renaming and casting some types from strings to integers. So let's just run that. So I don't have to worry about the Spark pool or anything. That starter pool is great. And if you're used to Synapse and it taking 3 or 4 minutes to start up a Spark cluster, that's a thing of the past. So Spark session started in 13 seconds. And it gets stuck right into it. While that's running, I'll just add the next bit of code because we're just showing the fact that, yeah, we're reading the data, but let's actually write it. Yeah, the next step is to write it. Generally takes about 45 seconds. There we go. We can see the schema. And we can see the first couple of rows. So we're definitely getting data. Because it's still in the same Spark session, that filtered DF is still alive. So now we can run this cell and do something with it. So we're calling the table trips, and we're going to overwrite that table if it exists, doing it in the Delta format, partitioning by year and month, and saving it to tables/trips. And that'll go into the current lakehouse that's attached. So we should see under tables, trips appears. And I'll kick that off now and then start talking about the rest of it. So we can see from the comments below, it took 4 minutes, 47 seconds on an F8 to write 262 million rows. On an F2, it took about 8.5 minutes. So given that we're currently F8, I'm expecting around about the 5-minute mark. So there are a couple of settings that we've turned on up here, which is to enable the V-order write. So V-order is essentially taking the VertiPack optimizations that Power BI has and applying that while it's writing the Parquet files into the data lake. So that's only available in Fabric, but it can give you a 5 to 10 times compression, better compression than you could otherwise get. And it makes Power BI run like a dream when you query it. The second one there for the Delta optimize write, that is available in Synapse. I believe it's unset by default. So I've turned both of those on. So it's going to be the most optimal kind of write it can do. So while that's running for another 3 or 4 minutes, let's have a look at the monitoring hub. Always wary of clicking off things when it's doing it, but we'll see how it goes. So the monitoring hub inside Power BI, if you've only been using it for Power BI, it's a great addition. It came out at Build back in May. But allows you to see all your data set refreshes, and if you're using Fabric, it lets you see how all your Fabric things have been running. The main thing to note here is, especially if you have a smaller Spark pool, is your notebook might keep that session open for quite a while. And if you're using a very small pool, you might only be able to get 2 or 3 notebook sessions open at a time. So you may need to come in here and just cancel an existing one so you can open a new notebook. Shouldn't be a problem on an F8 today, but worth noting. And that'll stay in progress typically for about 15 minutes after it finishes running. While it's running, there's no extra comments. Cool. Let's have a look at OneLake. So I've opened the Windows Explorer, Windows File Explorer on my other monitor here and just making sure I'm not showing anything I shouldn't. Excellent. So we have a new extension which is the OneLake extension. Much like the OneDrive Explorer extension, it allows you to look through the contents of the OneLake. And we can see here, I can see all the workspaces that I have access to. And because this is my own private tenancy and I'm the admin, that's all the Fabric workspaces I have. But we don't see the Melbourne one. Let's just sync from OneLake. It should show up. There it is. So now we can drop into it. We can see that, yep, there's my lakehouse, fashion.lakehouse. We can go in there, we can see files, we can see tables, and we can see metadata about the warehouse itself. If I go into tables, yep, I can see the trips table. And so far, there's just a Delta log directory, but it's still loading the data, so that's all right. So we should see a number of Parquet files showing up here. Another thing we can do is copy that up to a command line, and we can explore it through the command line. If you try and look at a file, maybe we have a CSV file up there. It will, you can type CSV, type file name.csv. It'll download the file and show you the contents as though it was a local. So very handy thing to have. I can also use this to copy files around the place. So let's dive back into the files section of my Lakehouse. And let's create a new folder. And we'll call this Towns. And we'll go into Towns. And let's grab a file. Here's a file here. Let's copy that guy. Copy it in. This data set is basically a CSV file containing 467 towns of Australia, including their name, their state, their postcode, their location, etc. So not a terribly exciting data set, but it's a good example of how you can use the OneLake Explorer to very quickly get data into the OneLake. Right. And I can get rid of that one. How's our taxi loading going? It finished. So 4 minutes, 30 seconds. It's a bit faster than last time. So let's have a look and see what's actually in there. So I'll do a Spark SQL command to describe that table. It's there. And we can see that it's 12 files, size in bytes. It's around about 2 gig. Yeah, I could do the conversion, but trust me, it's 2 gig. And we can see, the actual number of rows it wrote. There was 262 million rows processed. It does a little bit of double handling. That's why it's slightly larger, but 7 gig of, under 8 gig of reading and writing 2 gig. Right. So now that let's just refresh our Lakehouse here. Refresh tables. There's our trips table. So we can look at the schema. We can explore it. We'll also refresh the files. So there's the schema for trips. And we have a towns directory. And inside that, we can see the AU town sample.csv. So here we can either use Lowe's data into Spark, and that will allow us to query that inside this notebook. But I'm not going to do that. Pretty much giving up on my notebook for the moment. Let's open up the lakehouse itself. Go to Melbourne, open up my fashion lakehouse. Again, we can see our trips table, we can see towns, we can see our file. From here, we can load this file directly into an existing table or into a new table. So let's make it a new table. We'll call it AU Towns. We do have the header at the top. It's comma separated. Let's go load. And that will just go and load that 65 kilobyte CSV file into the Delta format. Reasonably quickly. Can come up here and see what process is or the progress is. There it goes, it's finished. So it's loaded AU Towns. And again, I can open a notebook, or we can have a look. Yep, there's all our state and latitude and longitude and names, etc. And we can view the data here as well. So brilliant, it's working. So we're starting to gather data. We've gathered data from a public repository. We've grabbed it from a CSV file that we've manually copied up and loaded. Let's get some data from my SQL database sitting on my desktop here. So if we go back into our Melbourne workspace, go a new job. Let's go a data flow Gen 2, which is in the data factory section. So glorious Power Query. I can choose from Excel or SQL Server or CSV or from an existing data flow. I can get from another source, and we can see all the different options to get data in. If you've used data flows before, you should be fairly familiar with how many there are. It's a lot of beta ones, but yeah, the one we're after is a SQL Server. So I can cancel out of that one and just go import from SQL Server. And then we have to give it some information about where this is. So it's sitting on-prem on my desktop. And the database is glorious AdventureWorks. Just to prove that it does exist, here it is here. I've got a view called DBO drivers. And it's basically got 18,500 driver IDs, first name, last name, birth date, and a vendor ID. So it does exist. If we don't already have a connection, we can create a new one and pass in usernames, passwords, etc. that we need. But that should be fine. My gateway is already set up to talk to this server. So we can see all our tables. We're just going to grab the driver's view. Let's preview. It's looking the same as Management Studio. We'll go create. And we're in the familiar Power Query editor. So it's loaded the data. Just for the fun of it, we'll add a new column, custom column. Call it name and I believe it's and science not. Okay. That's looking pretty good. It's concatenated the first name and the last name. So now we've changed the data a bit. Let's rename the data flow to load drivers. And we need a data destination. So unlike the data flows in Power BI today, which you can only really use to load data into Power BI or into a data mart, and in the back end it stores as CSV files. This allows us to choose any data destination we like. So we can go to Azure SQL Database, a Lakehouse, a ADX cluster, or a SQL warehouse. So in this case, we'll go to a Lakehouse. From memory, we keep that same connection. I just named it really poorly last time. And then it shows us all the lake houses that we have in our Power BI environment. I do have a lot more workspaces than Fabric workspaces, but it's showing me all of them. So we'll find the Melbourne one, open it up. It should be a fashion lake house. And we'll store that in the drivers table. That does a bit of validation. We can choose to replace or append. In this case, we'll keep it as is. Those data types are looking pretty good. I'll save that. So I haven't had to write a whole lot of code to get data from either the CSV file or from the SQL DB. I did for the taxi data, but so far it's been a fairly low code kind of environment. But we could go into PySpark and really drill into the code if we wanted to. Let's publish that. So we're starting to get stuff inside our workspace, and it's automatically running to load the drivers now. So that'll take a couple of minutes. So at this point, we've got a whole lot of data. Even more once that drivers one finishes. Let's jump back into the Lakehouse. Soon we'll see another table show up. But we can either look at the Lakehouse or we can use SQL to query this Lakehouse. So I'm going to jump over to the SQL endpoint. This option up the top here is the quick way to move between the Lakehouse and the SQL endpoint, but you can also go back to the workspace and click on the SQL endpoint directly. So the interface changes a little bit. It allows you to write SQL. There's also a visual query designer, which kind of gives you that Power Query like interface to write a SQL query. As a long-term SQL guy, I still feel weird and uncomfortable using that. But if you don't know SQL, it can be a good way to join things together.
At least he's honest.
Very weird and uncomfortable. All right. So we're still waiting on that driver table to come, but let's go a new SQL query. And unlike before, when we were in the notebook mode, we were doing Spark SQL. Now we're doing T-SQL. And for some reason, the screen has a really bad habit of jumping back to the table out of my query. Gets me every time. I don't know if our drivers table has loaded yet, but let's try a SQL query that involves the drivers table. So we're selecting from drivers, we're joining the trips table on the driver ID and grouping by the driver ID and the driver's full name that we created from that data flow, and then showing how many trips has each person done, total distance and total amount they've earned. Nope, we don't have the flow in there yet. It's still going. Better get there soon, otherwise this demo is destroyed.
Jim, I think on your import you might have missed to include the full name. Just your query there, I think, was using full name. I think you didn't select that on the import.
That could be a mistake. Let's have a look. That's our notebook. That's our lake house. I do want to be back in the lake house now. Here's our drivers table. Right you are. We don't have a full name. That's all right. We'll survive without it. Bad demo. While
right,
we're here,
I'm sure an experienced SQL guy like you can adjust your query to craft it on the fly.
I'm not sure if I sacrificed enough to the demo god today, but yeah, let's go back to that SQL query, which is in our, the icons change. So this is more the warehouse icon when we're looking at the SQL endpoint. It's having to reload the endpoint. Okay, so let's get rid of full name. We'll just go first name. And then we'll go there, and then we'll go there, and then we'll run it and see what happens. We don't really need the last name. We've got a driver ID in there. Yay, we get data back. So, and there should be about 1,000, is it 1,000 rows? For sure I only made 1,000. Yeah, it says 1,000 at the bottom right there. 1,000 rows because I only had 1,000 different driver IDs in the trips table. There's 18,000 actual drivers, but only 1,000 different driver IDs attached to the trips. So SQL has worked pretty well. What if we grab some data from Synapse? So one of the things I was always very curious about when starting to hear about this magical fabric thing is, you know, the V ordering makes Power BI run faster. You can query it faster. It's, you know, it's amazing. But you can also import data that, you know, Databricks or Synapse has produced. As long as it's a Delta table, we can read it. So let's pretend that we have a Synapse environment that we've been using for months, and we've loaded in the exact same data using the exact same code that I did to load my 2016 data. And it's currently sitting off on another storage account somewhere. As we saw on the slide deck, we can create a shortcut to that and insert it into our lakehouse. So if we jump back into the lakehouse, and my big question is, what's the performance like between the two? Because surely that V ordering thing, which is magical, should mean that it runs fast when we're querying the V ordered table, but what's it like when we query the other one? And we can go tables, we can go new shortcut. We can choose from a different OneLake workspace or even a different engine inside the one workspace. We can grab it from S3, we can grab it from ADLS. Let's grab it from ADLS. And here's a URL I prepared earlier. And it already knows my connection details, which I was just using the account key to attach in this case. This storage account is also located in Australia East. So again, we're not doing any crazy cross-region data movement. And then we just need to give the shortcut a name. Let's call it Taxi Synapse. Synapse. And go. So it's there. It's got a slightly different icon indicating that it's a shortcut. If we dive into our One Lake Explorer and jump back up to the lake house, onto tables, go up to there, from One Lake, we can see all our tables here. So we can dive into the trip synapse and we can see our partition by year and then our partition by month. But it's just a logical view. None of these files are actually sitting inside One Lake. But the Explorer makes it look like it is, which is super cool. So now we have data from both the stuff we just loaded and the Synapse code. And to be fair, I loaded the Synapse version with exactly the same code. So I even set the V ordering on, knowing that it wouldn't do anything, but also optimizing the write for the Delta. That one does do something. And the end result is the trip Synapse comes out to about 2.6 gig and 45 files rather than 12 files for trips. So trips has compressed a bit better. It will depend on what sort of data you've got in there as to whether or not VertiPack can really compress it well and reorder it correctly. But yes, we now have 4 tables. And that means we can go back to our SQL endpoint. And we could replace this query. Let's just run it a couple of times just to see how fast it is. So 3.6 seconds. If we did a real test, we'd do it a couple of times just to see how much crazy caching is going on. 4.1 seconds. Let's replace trips with Synapse trips. Run it again. Oh, it fails. Is it because I named it something wrong? Trip Synapse. It was the other way around, wasn't it? First time it runs, it can take a little bit of time just to warm up. So 9 seconds. Subsequent runs, it's usually around about the 3 or 4 second mark. So it's about the same. So there's only a 600 megabyte difference, but it's still pretty good. Right. We can also do some other queries. I've got a looking at trips and towns, joining that on twice, just based on the pickup location ID and the drop-off location ID. I fully comprehend the disconnect in my head about the whole New York City taxis and Australian place names. Just ignore that. But that's grab the top 100 rows, 11 seconds. If we run it again, it should be pretty quick. 2 seconds. So yeah, there is a fair bit of caching going on inside Fabric, but because it's software as a service, one of the downsides is you don't get as many knobs to control how Fabric is doing things. But many of those knobs you don't have to worry about. It's, it's handling the caching, it's handling tuning, it's doing a lot of magic for you. And magic is, I think, the right word, because you don't get to know exactly what it's doing behind the scenes. I don't know what it's doing behind the scenes. Cool, so I've got data. You don't need the knobs, it just works. And every database guy I mentioned that to goes, but yeah, you don't trust that. You want to know how it works, you want the knobs. But yeah, from my experience, the knobs aren't that critical. I haven't come across a situation yet where I've needed the knobs. So yeah. All right. So the final demo is to actually put this into Power BI. So we've got a model. So we're still in the SQL view. And the model knows about all these tables. There's no relationships. So we're going to need some relationships so we can do some stuff with this. So I can grab the driver ID and drag it to the drivers table. Usually figures this all out itself. Usually quicker when it's cached everything. Excuse me. Many to one. If we tick the assume referential integrity, because you don't have foreign keys between Delta tables, we just have to assume it. It will do a validation check to make sure it is okay. And it will tell you if that referential integrity doesn't currently make sense. So we'll add that relationship in. We'll also grab it from the trip synapse, just for the fun of it. Driver ID to driver ID. I can go off and do this without waiting for the automatic stuff. And you can also choose which tables will appear in your data set. You can also create brand new data sets with tables in the lakehouse. You can choose what tables you want to have in there. And we'll also grab the drop-off location ID joined to the AU towns. Again, many to one, make it active, assume referential integrity. Pretty sure this one will yell at me. I go to validate that. Yep, there are rows in the trips table without a matching row in the AU towns table. So we'll turn that one off. Cool. So we have a bit of a model. And that's all there. It's all done. We don't have to save it or anything. It's automatically saved. We can create new measures. We can create new reports if we want to use it through the browser. But let's not. Let's use Power BI desktop. Because I like to live dangerously. And of course, it opens up on the other monitor.
I was going to say you're living dangerously.
All right. So One Lake Data Hub. So we've got the option here to get it from lakehouses, or we can get Power BI data sets. This all depends whether or not you used a custom data set or whether it's related to the one from the lakehouse. So let's try the lakehouse one. That's the one we want, the one we just edited. There's a few other ones in my environment, but we can choose to connect or connect to the SQL endpoint. That would be better for direct query, but let's just connect directly to the model, which will be Direct Lake. The initial connection can be a little bit slow, but once it's in, it's in. There we go. Let's grab a table. Let's grab the driver's first name, last name, driver ID, and let's grab the total amount. One thing I didn't do inside the model was change what the default summarization of some things are. But it's looking pretty good as is. And these are very rich drivers by the looks of it. They're all bringing in about $2 million, which is pretty good for a year. Yeah, clearly a random ID assigning trips to 1,000 drivers was maybe not the most accurate way of creating that dummy data, but it works. And let's copy that, paste it, and change that total amount to the trips synapse total amount. Go again. And then if we really wanted to, those numbers should match. They are coming from two different locations, but they are matching, so that's good. Even though this table is 600 megabytes bigger than this one. We can go over to the optimize pane, look at the performance analyzer, start recording, refresh the visuals, and see the time that each one took. But I haven't really found a difference between these two tables. That was 4, that was 3, refreshing again. 1.8, 1.3, refreshing again, 1.7. Now they're about even, so yeah, I'm happy with that performance. Especially given as it means that I can continue to use the investments I've already made in Synapse or Databricks without having to then go and rewrite that same data into the V-ordered form, which would be exactly the same as doing an import, really, in terms of effort. So pretty happy with that. And given that it's Power BI, I could also start, grabbing a map visual. I could grab the latitude and longitude from my towns. Longitude goes there, latitude goes there. Legend could be the vendor ID of the driver. And the bubble size could be the count of any one of those rows. Count. Yeah. And it's a map with pie charts. Oh dear. But it looks like Australia, so I'm calling that a win. And yeah, there's more than 1,000 points, but it's still looking pretty good. So yeah, in terms of cross filtering, it looks pretty snappy. It's running nice. If I was to put a slicer on vendor ID of the trip, for example, note I didn't have a vendor ID table anywhere. So this is filtering that 2 gig table. And other than the fact that it's loading a whole lot of rows, it's refreshing pretty quickly. So I'm calling that a win without having to import anything to Power BI. So that's pretty much the end of my crazy demo in an hour. So we didn't look at Data Factory pipelines. They are very similar to Data Factory. We didn't look in detail at the warehouse. We didn't look at ML models or experiments. We didn't look at the KQL, so Azure Data Explorer type databases. We didn't look at the Git integration, mostly because it's only really there for Power BI at this stage. We didn't look at data marts, and we didn't touch anything to do with AI. But if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to talk about any of those things.
Questions?
Oh, I have a question. With Synapse, you mentioned that the clusters for Spark Compute take about 3 to 5 minutes.
Yep.
How's the Fabric spinning them up in 10 seconds?
They're basically already there and ready to go as part of a pool of servers. So because it's software as a service, yeah, basically when you want to start up a Spark session, we grab some from the available pool and just go, yep, you're ready to go. Go for it.
Okay.
So it's a much nicer experience. The security implications of that in the back end is probably what we'll need to get a good answer to. Because I know a lot of my customers are going to ask, what is the security side of all this? Most of my customers are federal government, and yeah, they look into that in quite a bit of detail.
I have a question.
Yes.
So in Synapse, we have a recurring use case where we'd have serverless mode, and then we'd have Power BI running an import over a serverless endpoint.
Yep.
And then, then it's no longer running the query, so we're not incurring costs. And then Power BI's import mode, so we're all good. In terms of Fabric, how do we turn off the, say, Fabric-based data engineering parts, whereas keep the Power BI workspace running? Is it possible?
It is possible. So the interesting thing, I'm not sure if it's a bug or not, but if you do happen to pause your Fabric capacity, you can still see the files through the OneLake Explorer, which is kind of cool. But you can't query them because you still need compute to actually query them. So you can copy them, but you can't process them using any of the engines. So what you could do there is because you don't need the compute running to access the files in the lake, you could have one capacity that processes all the files, and then you create on a different capacity, perhaps your existing Power BI Premium, you could use a data set there to shortcut from that other workspace into the one that's actually running.
Okay, yeah.
So you still need to provide some sort of compute for Direct Lake, but yeah, at least that allows you maybe just to have a capacity dedicated just to Power BI, but allowing you to take away all the other Fabric workloads from it.
Okay, thanks.
It'd be good for licensing too, because the premium capacity or F64 will allow everyone to access it without a pro license.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Yeah, yes, please. So we have an existing Synapse data warehouse and a whole bunch of ADF ETL pipelines. How do we get those into Fabric? What's the transition story?
So we haven't yet published a migration path, but you can, because the technology under the covers is pretty much the same, especially in the pipeline side. So it is actually possible to mount an existing Azure Data Factory into Fabric. I'm not sure if that actually imports it or if it just runs it from within the Fabric context. I haven't actually tried it yet. I've just seen it done. Yeah, getting pipelines in should be relatively easy. The bigger change that we will have to think about the migration path is for the dedicated SQL pools.
Yeah.
How do you copy it from one to the other? What process should you use? Because in Synapse, it's under the covers, it's basically all Azure SQL DBs. In Fabric, it's Delta files all the way down. So yeah, the actual migration path is the bit that's yet to be determined. But I suspect it'll be a case of here's a copy data activity from one to the other.
So we'll end up writing a one-off ADF pipeline that's our migrate to Fabric now, and that'll be it.
Yeah, or perhaps Microsoft will come up with a magical import dedicated SQL pool to OneLake button somewhere, which could simplify it.
Okay, thank you.
The other good thing about the
Microsoft create the button is probably means it's going to be a lot cheaper rather than you having to spin up the compute to run that pipeline, and particularly if you have a rather large Synapse dedicated pool.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could definitely take a while. So kind of the guidance at the moment that I've been telling all my customers is your investments in Synapse and Databricks and all these other existing platforms, they're still good. So Synapse isn't going away just because we have Fabric. And Fabric allows you to take what you've built inside Synapse and make it available to Fabric. So there's no, as soon as Fabric goes GA, there's no great reason to immediately import everything into Fabric. It's more a case of keep doing what you're doing in Synapse, and as you get a new workload, consider building that into Fabric. And we're also getting the ability to mount dedicated SQL pools into Fabric at some point. So just like any other sort of shortcut, you'll be able to shortcut your dedicated SQL pool into Fabric and query it from within Fabric as though it was local.
Right.
Anything else?
Gotcha.
Any other questions online?
I do have a question. I don't know if you can hear me though. Okay. What about vacuuming on the data on lake? Is it auto handled, or is it something that we have to run manually?
Vacuuming is one of those things that's kind of auto handled, but you can run it yourself. I'm pretty sure there's a doco page there that describes it. But yeah, it's still something you want to consider just in general when you're using Delta.
Yeah, and another one along the similar lines. What about how does V order versus Z order kind of come into play, especially when you're dealing with Databricks, which kind of loads data in the Z order, or the recommendation is to kind of go Z order?
Yeah, so I still haven't figured out exactly how this little bit of magic works, but essentially whether you write it in, if you do write it with V order, Databricks still has no problems reading the files. Even though, compression is better and it's faster and it just has no problem reading the files, which sounds weird. It can't write it because it doesn't have the algorithm, but it can read it just fine. So the only option you get is, do you want to turn vOrder on or off with Fabric? So yeah, it is recommended that you do turn it on. And that's basically the default for every engine except for notebooks, because notebooks you can turn on or off. But the SQL Warehouse, the KQL, Power BI, all those engines, you don't get any control over that one, so it's always on. But at the same time, if you have shortcutted in a file that has used the standard Z ordering rather than the V ordering, Fabric can read that just fine as well.
Alrighty, I think that's about it for now, and we're pretty much at time. So thanks everyone for coming. We do a little door prize for those people that are here. So before you leave, we will draw that. I wanted to thank Jim for giving up his Tuesday night from lovely cold Canberra, because I refuse to believe it's sunny Canberra.
I didn't say it wasn't cold.
No, I said
sunny.
It's not cold. It's not sunny, but it's always cold. So thank you very much for coming and chatting to us. I think we all really appreciate it. Just a little bit of group admin. After many years, we've finally set up a Twitter account for the Melbourne Data Platform User Group, and also a Threads account. So if you search for Melbourne Data UG, and I'll post it in the comments in the meetup as well. On either two of those platforms, it's just a little bit easier to get word out about events and ask questions back to us or suggestions around topics, things like that. We're still trying to line up a speaker for next month, but we've got people in mind and set up. It's just a scheduling thing more than anything else. So a few different topics, but if you've got any suggestions for topics, please feel free to reach out to us. Either through Meetup or through Twitter or what is it, X or whatever, Threads. I'll go down the 80 other social media paths if people think that's worth it, but I figure that might be a good start. And hopefully we'll have the recording up. I only set it up today, so, maybe refresh. We do have a YouTube channel now where we're posting the recordings. So same thing, the tag Melbourne Data UG, all one word, is sort of what we're trying to standardise to. Can always just do this and show you that it really does exist, I promise. Is that sharing? That's not even sharing. So, so yeah, please jump on, use it as a chance to chat, get with each other, with us as organisers and things like that. And yeah, after that, it's pretty much same time, same place next month, second Tuesday of the month. And yeah, we'll let you know what the topic is when we get around to it. Someone who's left, I guarantee it. 57. Awesome. Come and see me before you leave. Thank you. So yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you. And I'm more than happy to stay on a little bit longer and talk and answer any other questions if anyone wants to hang about.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. You dressed that up well.
Fabric tons.
You were waiting the whole hour to say.
Yep.
That's probably a good place to cut the recording.